The pen was already in her hand when the door opened, and the life she thought she was about to sign away turned out to be the smallest thing in that room. Eleanor Hale sat at the head of a long conference table, her fingers steady around a pen that felt heavier than it should have. Across from her, Richard's attorney slid a thick document toward her, with the kind of confidence that only comes from a man who believes he already knows how this story ends. Beside him, Richard did not look at her. He looked at the paper. His mother, Vivian, sat with her arms folded and a faint, satisfied smile, the smile of a woman who had gotten exactly what she wanted. Eleanor had agreed to sign. She had told herself it did not matter, that love did not need proof written in legal language, that if Richard needed this to feel safe, she would give it to him without complaint. Then a man she had not invited into the room walked through the door without knocking. He set a sealed folder on the table, looked directly at Richard's lawyer, and said a number out loud that no one in that room was prepared to hear. $500 million. The room went completely still. Richard's pen slipped from his hand. Vivian's arms came slowly undone, and Eleanor, the only person at that table who already knew the truth, did not say a word. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to subscribe to StoryMind so you never miss another unforgettable story. 6 months earlier, none of this would have seemed possible. Eleanor Hale was, by every outward appearance, an ordinary woman living an ordinary life in a small rented apartment outside Sacramento, spending her days restoring old furniture in a shop she did not own, and her evenings alone with a cup of tea and a book she rarely finished. She had a way of making herself smaller than she was, a habit built over years of being told, gently but repeatedly, that wanting more for herself was somehow impolite. She had met Richard Cole at a mutual friend's dinner party 18 months earlier. He was charming in the way that men who have never had to try very hard are charming, attentive at first, generous with his time, quick to make her laugh. He came from a family with a name that still meant something in certain circles, though the money behind that name had grown thinner than anyone outside the family knew. What Eleanor never told him, not once in 18 months, was that her grandfather Arthur Hale, a quiet, private man who had raised her after her parents died when she was 12, had built one of the most successful holding companies on the West Coast, and that Eleanor was his only living heir. Arthur had died 2 years before Eleanor met Richard. His will contained a single unusual condition. Eleanor could not reveal the size of her inheritance to anyone until she found someone who chose her without knowing what she was worth. She had believed, foolishly perhaps, that Richard was that person. Then came the prenup. It was Vivian who pushed hardest for it, framing it in the language of protection, insisting that Richard's business interests needed to be shielded no matter how much they loved each other. Richard had gone along with it, quietly, almost apologetically, and Eleanor had let him believe there was nothing to protect him from. She had no idea, sitting across from his mother that afternoon, that Vivian already knew far more about the Hale name than she was letting on. And she had no idea that the moment Mr. Whitmore said that number out loud, everything she had spent 2 years trying to hide would come apart in front of the one person she had hoped would never need convincing to love her. The question was no longer whether Richard would find out. The question was whether what he felt for her had ever been real to begin with. To understand how Eleanor ended up at that table, it helps to understand who she was before Richard Cole ever walked into her life. Her grandfather Arthur raised her in a modest 2-story house in Fair Oaks, a house with creaking floors, and a workshop out back, where he spent most of his evenings. He was not a warm man in the way people usually mean that word, but he was steady, and he was honest, and he never once made Eleanor feel like a burden, even though he had taken her in at 58 years old, with no warning and no preparation. He worked, as far as Eleanor understood growing up, in investments. He wore the same 3 suits on rotation. He drove a car that was 11 years old when he finally traded it in. He taught Eleanor to balance a checkbook before she turned 13 and told her, more than once, that money revealed people faster than almost anything else in life. She did not know until after his death exactly how much money he meant. Arthur Hale had spent 4 decades quietly building Hale Industries into a diversified holding company with interests in real estate, manufacturing, and agriculture across 3 states. He had done it without ever appearing on a magazine cover, without ever attaching his name to a building, without ever letting the scale of what he built become part of his identity. When he died, the company and its holdings were valued at just over $500 million, and every bit of it went to Eleanor. The will, drafted with unusual precision by his longtime attorney Mr. Whitmore, included one binding condition. The inheritance would remain in a private trust, invisible to public record, until Eleanor either married or reached her 50th birthday, whichever came first. And if she married before then, her spouse could not be told the size of the estate until Mr. Whitmore determined, through direct observation, that the marriage had been built on something other than money. At the time, Eleanor had found the condition almost insulting, as though her grandfather doubted her judgment. It was only much later that she understood he had been trying to protect her from something he had seen happen to other families, wealth attracting the wrong kind of attention long before love ever had the chance to prove itself. For 2 years after Arthur's death, Eleanor lived quietly on a modest allowance drawn from the trust, working small jobs mostly to fill her days, rather than out of necessity, telling almost no one the truth of her situation. Only one person knew. Her closest friend since college, Grace Simmons, had been there the day the will was read, and had kept the secret without ever once treating Eleanor differently because of it. It was Grace who convinced Eleanor to come to that dinner party where she met Richard. Richard Cole was, in almost every visible way, the opposite of Eleanor's quiet life. He owned a boutique real estate development firm that had once carried real weight in Sacramento's commercial market, inherited from his father alongside the Cole family name, a name that still opened doors even as the business behind it had grown steadily less stable. He was polished, well-spoken, generous with compliments, and from the very first conversation, he made Eleanor feel like the only person in the room worth talking to. She fell for him slowly, and then all at once, the way people often do when loneliness has been quietly waiting for an opening. For the first several months, everything between them felt easy. He introduced her to his friends. He remembered small details about her life and brought them up days later. He told her, on their 6th date, that he had never met anyone who made him feel less like he had to perform. It was around the 4th month that Eleanor first noticed something she could not quite name. Richard asked questions about money more often than seemed natural, not aggressively, but consistently, weaving them into casual conversation. What her rent was, whether she had savings, what her plans were for retirement, phrased as though he were simply curious, not as though he were gathering information. She told herself it meant nothing. Some people were simply more comfortable talking about money than others. She did not yet know that Richard's business was quietly failing, that 2 of his family's commercial properties were behind on payments, and that his mother Vivian had begun looking, with increasing urgency, for a way to stabilize the family's finances before the truth became public. She did not yet know that Vivian had recognized the name Hale the very first time Richard mentioned Eleanor's grandfather and had said nothing. Vivian inserted herself into the wedding planning almost immediately, not out of warmth, but out of what she described as necessity, given how much the Cole name meant in Sacramento society. She selected venues without asking Eleanor's opinion. She corrected Eleanor's clothing choices at family dinners with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. And 3 months before the wedding, she sat Richard down privately and told him, in no uncertain terms, that a prenuptial agreement was not optional. Richard brought it to Eleanor gently, almost apologetically, framing it as his mother's request rather than his own. He told her it was simply business, a formality that protected the company his father had built, nothing more. He told her he trusted her completely and that the document would never mean anything between them. Eleanor listened, and something in her chest went quiet and small. She had spent 2 years hiding the truth of who she was because her grandfather had asked her to wait for someone who loved her without needing to know. Now the man she was about to marry was asking her to sign away rights to money he did not know she had, money that dwarfed anything the Cole family had ever possessed, and she found herself unable to say a single word about it. She agreed to the prenup the following week. What she did not know was that Vivian had already had her own attorney quietly investigate Eleanor's background and that the investigation had turned up nothing, no property, no significant assets, nothing beyond a modest apartment, and a small inheritance listed only as an amount far smaller than the truth, exactly as the trust's confidentiality protections were designed to show. Vivian took this as confirmation of what she had begun to suspect, that Eleanor was, financially speaking, nobody, and that meant the prenup would protect her son from a woman who had, in Vivian's private assessment, married up. It never occurred to Vivian that the numbers had been hidden on purpose. It never occurred to Richard either, not fully, though there were moments in the weeks before the wedding when he would catch himself wondering why Eleanor never seemed anxious about money the way most people in her position might be. She never asked him for anything. She never negotiated the terms of the prenup beyond a few small clarifications. She simply signed and moved forward, and Richard told himself that this was simply the kind of woman she was, calm, undemanding, easy. He did not yet understand that her calm came from somewhere he could not see. 3 weeks before the wedding, Grace confronted Eleanor privately, the only person who could speak plainly about what was happening. She asked Eleanor directly why she was allowing herself to be treated this way, why she would let Vivian dictate terms to a woman worth $500 million, why she had not simply told Richard the truth and let the prenup conversation resolve itself in an instant. Eleanor's answer was quiet but firm. She said that if she told him now, out of frustration, out of a need to win an argument, she would never know whether he loved her or the number attached to her name. She said her grandfather had waited his entire life to build something real, and she was not willing to skip the one test he had asked her to honor. Grace did not agree with the decision, but she understood it, and she promised, as she always had, to keep the secret until Eleanor was ready to reveal it herself. Neither of them knew that the timeline was about to be taken entirely out of Eleanor's hands. 2 weeks before the wedding, Mr. Whitmore called Eleanor with news that changed everything. As part of the trust's standard procedure, a routine legal review had flagged the prenuptial agreement Richard's attorney had drafted, not because of anything improper in the document itself, but because the trust required any prenup signed by Eleanor to be reviewed by the estate's own legal counsel before it could be considered valid against the trust's holdings. In other words, the moment Eleanor signed that prenup, Mr. Whitmore would be legally required to appear and disclose, at minimum, the general scope of the estate the agreement was attempting to address, whether Eleanor was ready for that conversation or not. Eleanor asked if there was any way to delay it, any way to have the conversation privately with Richard before it became a spectacle in front of his entire family. Mr. Whitmore, gently but firmly, told her no. Arthur had written the provision himself, specifically to prevent exactly the kind of quiet manipulation Eleanor had been trying to avoid. If a prenup was going to attempt to define what Eleanor was or was not entitled to, the truth would have to be known before it could be legally binding. For the first time since her grandfather's death, Eleanor understood that his strange, rigid conditions had never been about controlling her. They had been about making sure that whatever came next in her life, it would happen honestly, in the open, no matter how uncomfortable that honesty turned out to be. She went into the signing knowing exactly what was about to happen. Richard did not. The signing was scheduled for a Tuesday afternoon at Richard's family attorney's office, a formality everyone assumed would take 20 minutes. Vivian arrived early, dressed as though she were attending a business acquisition rather than a family legal meeting, which in a sense, she was. Richard arrived looking tired, distracted by a business call he had taken in the parking lot, one of several he had been fielding all week regarding a delayed payment on one of the Cole family's commercial properties. Eleanor arrived last and sat down without a word. The attorney reviewed the terms briefly, the same terms Eleanor had already read a dozen times, terms that would have left her, in the event of a divorce, with almost nothing beyond what she had brought into the marriage, which on paper appeared to be very little at all. The pen was placed in front of her. She picked it up. And that is the exact moment Mr. Whitmore opened the door. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He introduced himself simply as counsel for the Hale estate, apologized for the interruption, and explained that under the terms of a trust established by the late Arthur Hale, Any prenuptial agreement involving Eleanor Hale required disclosure of the estate's holdings before it could be considered enforceable. Then he said the number, $500 million. Richard's first reaction was not anger, it was confusion. The particular kind of confusion that comes from realizing the story you have been living in for the last year and a half was never the story you thought it was. He looked at Eleanor, searching her face for some sign that this was a mistake, some indication that Mr. Whitmore had the wrong family entirely. Eleanor did not look away. She had spent 2 years preparing for a version of this moment, though she had never imagined it happening like this, in front of Vivian, in front of a room full of lawyers, without the privacy or the tenderness she had once hoped it would carry. Vivian's reaction was the one that would haunt the family for months afterward. Her face moved through disbelief, then something closer to recognition, then a stillness that Eleanor would later understand was not surprise at all, but the particular stillness of a woman realizing a secret she had been keeping was about to collide with a secret she never knew existed. Because Vivian Cole had heard the name Hale before, long before Richard ever met Eleanor, and what she knew about that name was about to change the meaning of everything that had happened over the last 18 months. The room sat in silence for what felt like a very long time. Richard's attorney was the first to speak, asking Mr. Whitmore to clarify the source of the figure, as though a number that large might simply be a misunderstanding that could be corrected with the right paperwork. Mr. Whitmore did not raise his voice. He simply opened the folder, removed a single summary document prepared by the trust's accountants, and placed it on the table where everyone could see it. Richard did not reach for it. He kept his eyes on Eleanor. He asked her, quietly, how long she had known. Eleanor told him the truth. She had known since she was 26 years old, since the day her grandfather's will was read in this very same city, at a different office, with only Grace and Mr. Whitmore beside her. She told him about the condition in the will, about her grandfather's belief that money changed the way people were treated long before it changed anything else, about her decision to wait until she found someone who chose her, without needing the number, to make that choice easy. She told him she had wanted to tell him. She told him she had waited for a moment that felt right, and that moment had never come, because somewhere underneath the affection and the shared plans and the wedding invitations already mailed to 200 guests, she had never fully stopped wondering whether Richard's feelings for her would survive contact with the truth. Richard's response was not what Eleanor expected. He did not ask about the money itself. He asked why she had let him go through with the prenup at all, why she had sat across from his mother and signed away rights to a life she could have simply told him did not need protecting. Eleanor's answer was simple. She had wanted to see what he would fight for when he believed there was nothing to gain by fighting. It was Vivian who broke the silence that followed, and what she said turned the room in an entirely different direction. She told Eleanor that the name Hale was familiar to her, and had been for a very long time, though not in the way anyone in that room expected. She said that nearly 30 years earlier, when the Cole family's business had come dangerously close to collapse during a difficult recession, an anonymous investor had quietly purchased a controlling stake in 2 failing properties, restructured the debt, and then, once the company had stabilized, sold the stake back to Richard's father for a fraction of what it was worth, on the sole condition that the family never learn who had saved them. Vivian said she had only ever seen the name attached to the transaction once, buried in a legal document she was never meant to see. The name on that document was Arthur Hale. Eleanor sat with this information the way a person sits with news they cannot yet process, aware only that the ground beneath the entire relationship had shifted in a direction none of them had anticipated. Because if Vivian was telling the truth, then Eleanor's grandfather had quietly saved the Cole family decades before Eleanor ever met Richard, and Vivian, recognizing the name the moment Richard first mentioned Eleanor, had said nothing, not out of confusion, but because she had immediately understood exactly who Eleanor might be, and had chosen, for reasons of her own, to let the relationship unfold without correcting the story Richard believed he was living inside. The question was no longer simply whether Richard had married Eleanor for love or for money. The question was whether Vivian had guided her son toward Eleanor from the very beginning, hoping to reconnect the family fortune to the very name that had quietly kept them afloat once before, without either of the 2 people getting married ever knowing the debt that connected them. Eleanor left the office that afternoon without signing anything. She did not go home. She drove instead to Grace's house, sat at her kitchen table, and said almost nothing for nearly an hour, replaying every small moment of the last 18 months against this new information, wondering how much of what she believed about her relationship with Richard had been real, and how much had been shaped, quietly and invisibly, by his mother's long memory of a name she had never forgotten. Grace asked her the only question that mattered. Did she believe Richard had known any of this? Eleanor did not have an answer yet. She only knew that the wedding, scheduled for 11 days later, could not proceed as though nothing had happened. She called Richard that night and told him she needed time, not to plan a wedding, but to understand what kind of family she was actually marrying into, and whether the man she loved existed independently of the mother who seemed to have shaped this entire relationship long before Eleanor ever walked through that door. Richard, for his part, spent that night confronting his mother directly for the first time in his adult life, demanding to know exactly how much she had known and for how long, and whether his entire courtship with Eleanor had been something Vivian had engineered, rather than something that had simply happened between two people who found each other at a dinner party. Vivian's answer was not a full confession, not at first. She insisted she had only recognized the name after the relationship was already underway, that she had never orchestrated anything, that the timing had simply worked in the family's favor, and she had not seen the harm in staying quiet about a coincidence. Richard did not believe her, not entirely, and for the first time in his life, he found himself questioning every piece of guidance his mother had ever given him regarding his relationships, his business decisions, and the version of himself he had built to please her. Over the following week, the wedding was quietly postponed, though not cancelled, a distinction that mattered enormously to both families and to the 200 guests left wondering what had happened. Eleanor spent that week doing something she had never allowed herself to do before, investigating her own relationship the way she might have investigated a business partnership, looking for the places where affection and strategy had blurred together without her noticing. She discovered, through records Grace helped her track down, that Vivian had contacted 3 separate mutual acquaintances in the 6 months before that dinner party, each time asking casually whether they knew anyone suitable to introduce to Richard, each time steering the conversation toward women with quiet, modest backgrounds rather than the socially prominent families Vivian usually preferred for her son. It was Grace's own cousin, in fact, who had originally suggested inviting Eleanor to the dinner party where she met Richard, at Vivian's gentle suggestion, though Vivian had never once made her interest in Eleanor specifically obvious. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidence. Vivian had been looking for someone specific, someone unassuming, someone whose background might trace back to a name she remembered from a document she had once seen decades earlier and had never been able to forget. Whether she had known Eleanor specifically was Arthur Hale's granddaughter before the dinner party, or whether she had simply recognized the name once Richard mentioned it and quietly decided not to interfere with what fortune seemed to be offering the family a second time, remained the one question no one could fully answer, including, perhaps, Vivian herself. What mattered now was what Richard would do with the truth. He came to Eleanor 11 days after the failed signing, without his mother, without an attorney, without any of the polish that had first drawn Eleanor to him at that dinner party. He told her he had spent the last week trying to separate what he felt for her from what his mother had clearly hoped to gain, and that the process had been more difficult and more revealing than he expected. He told her that he did not know, and could not know with total certainty, whether his mother had engineered their meeting, but he told her that none of the small moments between them, the late-night conversations, the quiet mornings, the way she made him feel like he did not have to perform, had ever been engineered by anyone but the two of them. He told her he wanted to prove it, not with words, but by walking away from the very thing his mother valued most. He proposed dissolving his ownership stake in the family business entirely, stepping back from the Cole name's financial obligations, and building something new, smaller, entirely his own, regardless of what Eleanor decided to do about the wedding, regardless of whether she ever chose to share a single dollar of her inheritance with him. Eleanor listened to all of it and told him she needed to see it, not simply hear it. Over the following month, Richard did exactly what he said he would. He stepped away from the family business, a decision that caused a rupture with Vivian that took most of a year to even partially repair, and took a position at a mid-sized development firm where his family name meant considerably less and his own competence meant considerably more. Eleanor watched him build something modest and genuinely his own, and somewhere in that month of watching, she found herself believing, fully and without reservation, that the man beside her had chosen her long before either of them knew what the word worth actually meant. She told him the full truth soon after, not just the number, but the story behind it, her grandfather's insistence on honesty over comfort, the trust's unusual conditions, the reason she had waited so long to let anyone see the whole picture. Richard cried, quietly, the first time Eleanor had ever seen him do so, not because of the money, but because he finally understood how much trust she had been asking him to earn without ever explaining the terms. They married 6 months later than originally planned, in a small ceremony attended by fewer than 30 people, with a new prenuptial agreement that Eleanor herself insisted on, one that protected Richard's independence and his dignity just as thoroughly as it protected her inheritance, built not out of fear, but out of two people who finally understood exactly what they were choosing. Vivian attended the wedding. She did not speak much, and what she did say to Eleanor afterward was as close to an apology as her pride would allow, an acknowledgement that she had spent so many years protecting the family name that she had nearly cost her son the one relationship built on something more durable than money. Eleanor forgave her, not completely, and not quickly, but enough to let her back into their lives in small, careful steps. In the years that followed, Eleanor stepped forward publicly for the first time as the head of Hale Industries, using a portion of the estate to fund scholarships for young people being raised, as she once was, by relatives who never expected to become parents. She often said, in the rare interviews she agreed to give, that her grandfather's greatest lesson was not about protecting wealth, but about protecting the truth long enough to see who truly deserved to stand beside you. Richard built his own company over the following decade, one that eventually surpassed anything the Cole family had achieved before him, though he always maintained that its true value had nothing to do with its balance sheet. And somewhere in that quiet, hard-earned life they built together, the prenup that once threatened to define their marriage by what each of them stood to lose, became instead a symbol of what they had both been willing to risk in order to find something real. If you found out the person you loved never really knew who you were, would you want to be loved for what you have, or for who you have always been? We'd love to hear your answer in the comments. And if this story moved you, subscribe to StoryMind so you never miss the next one.